Welcome to this presentation on the topic of obedience. Social psychologists got interested in the study of obedience in the 1950s and 1960s, and mostly it was a response to events that were going on in the world. After World War II, as it became clear how horrible all of the stuff that had happened during the Holocaust was, people began to wonder, well, what is the matter with people who would follow orders to send so many people to their deaths in these concentration camps? Why didn't anybody stand up and do the right thing? Similarly, during the Vietnam War, news stories about atrocities committed by American soldiers started filtering back, and these were all people who everyone thought of as normal, well-adjusted American men. And what was wrong? So the notion was that there had to be something wrong with people who would follow such dreadful orders and do horrible things just because they were told to do so. So that's where psychologists started from. And the assumption was that they're doing this research to discover what predisposes a person toward becoming obedient. I'm getting a little ahead of myself to say this, but we're going to learn that it turns out that most of the individuals who did these horrible things were very normal people in very abnormal situations. So I'm going to be talking about the obedience experiments done by social psychologist Stanley Milgram, who you can see pictured in this slide right here. Milgram did a series of experiments, and I'm going to emphasize his earliest one, but a lot of other people followed up on the Milgram studies by doing replications where they changed one little thing or another. On the web page that accompanies this chapter of the social psych course, you can find links to videos from the early Milgram experiments. One of them is a long documentary film, about 45 minutes long. Another one is a much shorter one that just shows you a clip from the experiment. But you can watch both of them or neither of them for that matter, but I think you'll find them interesting. Anyway, in Milgram's original experiment, which he conducted at Yale University, the subjects were not college students. They were 40 adult males who were recruited through a newspaper ad and were participating in the study to earn some money. And they thought that they were in an experiment that was looking at the effects of punishment on learning. When the subject showed up at the laboratory, there was another person there who was supposedly another subject in the experiment, but he was really a confederate of Milgram. He was a 45-year-old guy who looked like an accountant, and he nervously shared at the beginning of the experiment that he had a slight heart problem, and he was hoping that this study would not be too stressful. So to get the study started, they had to decide which one of these two people would play the role of the teacher and which would play the role of the learner. Now the thing was rigged. They picked pieces of paper that guaranteed that the confederate would always be the learner and that the real subject would always be the teacher. So they were led into a laboratory where the learner, the confederate, was strapped into a chair and had electrodes attached to his body, and he was given a little device by which he could answer questions by pressing a button. This is the point at which the subject the confederate began to act nervous and talk about having a heart condition, just to make it clear that there was the potential for some harm here. The real subject in the experiment, the person who was going to play the role of the teacher, was seated in front of a panel that looked exactly like this. These are pictures from Milgram's original study. You'll notice it's a very imposing looking box with a series of switches, and the switches had numbers over them, starting with 15 volts going up to 450 volts, and then there were a few last switches that had no number over them at all, just 3 X's, and there was a little sign that said danger, severe shock. The teacher and the learner were in adjacent rooms. They could not see each other, but the teacher could hear the person on the other side of the room if he yelled or made any loud noises like that. So the learner would be sitting in the other room being prepared to answer questions. The teacher, who was the subject, would read questions over a microphone, and then if the learner gave the wrong answer, the teacher would flip a switch to give the person an electric shock. And with each question the person got wrong, they would crank up the juice. So each mistake would result in stronger and stronger shocks. At about 300 volts, the victim made this large pounding sound on the other room and refused to answer after that. And the subject was told, well, if he doesn't respond, just treat it like a wrong answer and give him the shock. Well, as you can imagine, this is a pretty stressful thing. You're giving shocks to a person that you think might have a heart condition. The person stops responding. And people believed this. Sometimes in our sophisticated modern mind, we think back on this and say, well, they knew it was fake. They weren't really worried. These people were very upset. Just watch some of the videos and you will see how uncomfortable these individuals were. What Milgram was interested in, of course, would people follow orders? Would they keep shocking all the way to the end, or would they resist? And if the person insisted on stopping at least 3 times, Milgram would count that as having resisted. What he found out, though, was 2/3 of his subjects went all the way. Even though they were upset and afraid, they continued to give the shocks just because they were told to do that. The first time they objected, they were told, well, we've spent a lot of time and money on this. It's important that it continues, so please continue. It wasn't until the 3rd objection that they were allowed to get out of the experiment. Here's a diagram that shows you a little bit about what the setup looked like. You've got the learner in one room, the subject in the other room, and you've got a photograph there showing who the experimenter was and what one of the subjects looked like. The Milgram experiments have become famous for a lot of reasons. First of all, we learned a lot about obedience. The assumption had been that people who were obedient and did bad things to other people because they were ordered to do that were defective in some way. The Milgram studies conclusively showed that normal, decent people will do crazy things just because they've been given orders to do that. And think about how little power the experimenter really had here. If the subject refused to continue, maybe worst case scenario is they didn't get paid, but nothing bad would happen to them. Compare that to the obedience pressures that a person would see in the military, for example. If your commanding officer commands you to do something, or in Nazi Germany, if you were found out to be helping Jews and other people that they were hunting, there were real consequences that you would pay, perhaps even with your life. And so even in situations like an experiment where there's not a lot at stake for the subject, you still see these high level of obedience occurring. Now, they did this study many times and found a variety of things that influenced the rate of obedience. They found that the prestige at Yale University probably helped. When they replicated this at an old warehouse somewhere that was supposedly being run by a company, the obedience rate dropped to about 50% from about 67%. They did find in other studies that people that scored high in authoritarianism were more likely to resist. They found if you made the victim's suffering more obvious that you got less obedience. So if the subject could hear the person screaming and being hurt, they were less likely to go all the way, although most of them still did. If they were in the same room and they could actually see the person suffering, now the obedience rate dropped to about 40%. And they even had a condition in one experiment where the subject had to actually go up and force the struggling victim's hand down onto a shock grid by pressing on this rubber mat on the top of his hands. There you found that 70% of the people were able to resist. But if you think of the flip side of that, that means 30% of them still went all the way even in this condition. So it's hard to talk about obedience in psychology without talking about the Milgram obedience experiments, because they've become the standard. Another reason they've become famous, of course, is because of the ethical concerns that they raised. The people who were subjects in this experiment were traumatized. They went through a very rough time, and it probably would not get approval today because the argument would be made the stress that the subjects experience is not worth whatever knowledge we might get. I might also add that there were some other variations of these experiments that were done where it wasn't an experimenter giving orders, but you were with a group of people, a couple of other subjects, and it was up to the group to decide how many shocks or how strong the shocks should be that you delivered. And you found that people, as in conformity, were very susceptible to the influence of the group, and they gave stronger shocks and went along with the group and did worse things than they would have done on their own.